Sometimes the hardest thing in life is knowing when to walk away from people and when to walk back toward them. For Tansie Bellford, 15 years alone in the Montana wilderness felt safer than facing what she left behind. She lives off-grid in the Bitterroot Mountains, keeping to herself with only her German shepherd for company. One autumn morning, she walks into the small town of Gable's Pass for supplies. Near the general store, she finds the mayor's dog suffering. When Tansie kneels down to help, what she discovers hidden in the animal's ears changes everything. It's not a medical problem. Someone did this on purpose. Mayor Clinton Deare shows up moments later, all smiles and expensive suits. But Tansie knows something is very wrong. What is the mayor hiding? And why does it feel connected to her own past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Tansie Bellford decided to leave her mountain sanctuary, frost still clung to the pine needles outside her cabin window. She'd been awake since before dawn, the way she always was, listening to the forest come alive with the small sounds of creatures going about their business. Kaiser, her German shepherd, lay stretched across the foot of her bed, his ears twitching at every creak of the cabin's timber frame. Tansie was 53 years old, though most days she felt both younger and older than that. Her hands were calloused from splitting wood and tending her garden. Her face was weathered from years of mountain sun and wind, lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth, but her body was still strong, still capable of the 10-mile hikes she took several times a week through the high country. Her hair, once dark brown, now showed more silver than not, and she kept it tied back in a practical braid that reached halfway down her back. The cabin she'd built with her own hands sat at 7,800 feet, tucked into a stand of lodgepole pines on the eastern slope of the Bitterroots. It wasn't large, just one room with a sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. But it was hers. She'd hauled every board up the mountain trail on her back, or on Kaiser's predecessor, an old mule named Jasper, who'd died 3 winters ago. The walls were chinked tight against the cold, and the roof was metal, proof against the heavy snows that buried this country from November through April. She had solar panels for minimal electricity, a propane tank for cooking, and a spring-fed creek that ran clear and cold year-round, 50 yards from her door. In the summer, she tended a garden of hardy vegetables, potatoes, carrots, onions, kale. She hunted deer and elk when she needed meat, and she'd become skilled at preserving food for the long winters. She had shelves lined with mason jars full of canned vegetables, jams, and pickled goods. It was a life that required constant work, constant attention, but it was a life she understood. 15 years she'd been up here. 15 years since she'd walked away from everything and everyone she'd known. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. Tansie pulled on her worn canvas work pants and a flannel shirt, then her boots, good leather ones she'd resoled twice already. She checked her pack, water bottle, first aid kit, knife, rope, emergency supplies. The habits from her military days never left. She'd served 12 years as a combat medic, seen things in Iraq and Afghanistan that still visited her in dreams. She'd come home at 38 with commendations, trauma, and an inability to exist in the normal world anymore. The noise had been too much. The traffic, the crowds, the constant barrage of stimulation. But more than that, she couldn't reconcile what she'd seen with the comfortable obliviousness of civilian life. People complaining about trivial things, while she remembered holding dying soldiers, some of them barely 20 years old. She'd tried for 6 months to make it work, living in Missoula, seeing a therapist, taking medication. But the walls kept closing in. So she'd come back to Gable's Pass, the small town where she'd grown up, thinking maybe the familiar would help. It didn't. The town had changed, or maybe she had. Either way, she couldn't stay. She bought land with her savings, filed for the necessary permits, and disappeared into the mountains. For the first year, people came looking for her. Concerned neighbors, a few persistent friends, even her former commanding officer. She turned them all away politely but firmly. She needed silence. She needed space. She needed to remember how to be human again on her own terms. Kaiser had come to her in year 3, a puppy someone had abandoned on a Forest Service road. She'd found him half-starved and brought him home, intending to take him to a shelter once he was healthy. But by then, they'd bonded. He became her companion, her early warning system, her link to something beyond her own thoughts. Now he was 8 years old, still strong and alert, devoted to her with the kind of loyalty that dogs give and humans rarely earn. The monthly supply run was a necessity Tansie endured rather than enjoyed. She needed things she couldn't make or grow: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, propane, various staples. She'd established a routine. First Saturday of each month, she'd hike the 8 miles down to where she kept an old Ford pickup truck under a tarp, then drive the remaining 12 miles into Gable's Pass. She'd hit the general store, maybe the hardware store if she needed something specific, then drive back and hike home before dark. The town knew her as that crazy mountain woman, though most people were polite enough not to say it to her face. She was a curiosity, a reminder that some people still chose to live outside the grid, outside the normal flow of modern life. Some folks thought she was running from something. Others figured she'd just given up on people. Both were partially true. Gable's Pass had been a mining town once, back in the late 1800s. Silver and copper had drawn prospectors and families, and for a few decades it thrived. But the mines played out, and like so many mountain towns, it nearly died. What saved it was location, pretty enough to attract tourists, close enough to larger cities to draw weekend visitors. By the time Tansie was born in 1972, it had transformed into a modest tourist town of about 800 permanent residents, swelling to a few thousand during summer months. Main Street ran 6 blocks, lined with false front buildings that had been carefully maintained to preserve that Old West charm that tourists loved. There was the Bitterroot Hotel, the general store run by Jolene Hicks, a couple of restaurants, a bar called the Silver Claim, a small grocery, a hardware store, and the usual assortment of gift shops selling local crafts and Montana souvenirs. The old mining office still stood at the end of Main Street, a 3-story brick building that had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its history reduced to a historical marker on the front lawn. Tansie had been born in Gable's Pass, grown up in a small house on Prospect Street. Her father had worked for the Forest Service, her mother had taught at the elementary school. They were good people, simple people, who'd raised her to be independent and strong. They'd both died while she was overseas, her father from a heart attack, her mother from cancer 6 months later. By the time Tansie made it home for the funerals, the house had already been sold, their possessions dispersed to relatives and charity. It was just as well. She had no use for those memories. She'd had friends once, in high school, and in those brief years before the military. Clinton Deare had been more than a friend. They'd dated for 2 years, made plans the way young people do. He was ambitious, smart, always talking about making something of himself. When she'd told him she was enlisting, he'd been furious. "You're throwing your life away," he'd said. "Stay here. We'll build something together." But she couldn't stay. She needed to see what was beyond these mountains, needed to test herself, needed purpose. She promised to come back, promised they'd figure it out. He'd promised to wait. He hadn't. By the time she came home on her first leave, he'd already moved on, dating some girl from Missoula. It hurt at the time, but distance and war had a way of putting teenage heartbreak in perspective. She hadn't thought about Clinton Deare in years. She knew he still lived in Gable's Pass. He was the mayor now, someone had mentioned years ago. She'd successfully avoided him during her monthly trips to town, which wasn't hard. Their worlds no longer overlapped. Kaiser stood and stretched, shaking himself from nose to tail. He knew the routine. Supply day meant a truck ride, which he tolerated, and usually a biscuit from Jolene at the general store, which he loved. Tansie scratched behind his ears, grabbed her pack, and they headed out. The hike down took 3 hours at a steady pace. The trail was one Tansie maintained herself, just wide enough for her and occasionally a pack animal. It switchbacked through dense forest, past granite outcroppings where marmots sunned themselves, through meadows that would be brilliant with wildflowers in another few weeks. The air smelled of pine and the particular sweetness of early mountain autumn. At the trailhead, her truck sat where she'd left it a month ago. She pulled off the tarp, checked the oil and tires out of habit, then loaded Kaiser into the passenger seat. The engine turned over on the second try, and she headed down the gravel Forest Service road toward pavement. Gable's Pass appeared gradually. First a few scattered houses, then more clustered development, then Main Street with its neat rows of carefully preserved buildings. It was mid-morning on a Saturday, so tourists were out, moving between shops with cameras and shopping bags. Tansie found parking behind the general store, in the alley where locals parked to avoid the tourist traffic. She had a list: coffee, flour, sugar, salt, batteries, propane canister, ammunition if they had the right caliber, and a few other sundries. Jolene would have most of it. The general store was one of those old-fashioned places that carried a little bit of everything: hardware, groceries, clothing, camping supplies. It smelled like wood polish and coffee, familiar and almost comforting. Jolene Hicks was 62, a widow who'd run the store for 30 years. She was one of the few people in town who treated Tansie like a normal human being, never asking invasive questions, never making Tansie feel like a curiosity. They'd developed an easy rapport built on mutual respect and minimal small talk. Tansie was reaching for the store's back door, Kaiser at her side, when she heard it. A low, pained whimper that made her freeze. Kaiser heard it too, his ears pricking forward, his body going alert. The sound came from behind a dumpster in the alley. Tansie moved toward it slowly, her medic instincts kicking in before her brain caught up. What she found made her heart clench. A dog lay curled on its side, a beautiful German shepherd with a distinctive black and tan coat. But its eyes were clouded with pain, its breathing labored. It wore a leather collar, expensive looking, with a brass nameplate that read Rex. Tansie knelt down, speaking softly. "Easy, boy. Easy now. Let me see what's wrong." The dog's tail thumped weakly. He recognized kindness even through his distress. Kaiser stayed back, giving space, but watching intently. Tansie ran her hands gently over the dog's body, checking for injuries. No obvious wounds, no broken bones. But when her fingers reached his ears, the dog yelped and pulled away. She looked closer. The dog's ears were swollen, the skin around them red and irritated. But it was more than infection. There was something unnatural about the way the tissue was raised, as if something had been inserted beneath the skin. Tansie had seen battlefield injuries, surgical wounds, infections of every kind. This was deliberate trauma, recently inflicted. "What did they do to you?" she whispered. The dog looked at her with eyes that held intelligence and suffering in equal measure. This was a working dog, or had been. She could tell by his build, his bearing. He'd been someone's partner once, trusted and valued. Now he was abandoned behind a dumpster, hurting and alone. She heard footsteps approaching from Main Street, multiple people, voices carrying that tone of authority and entitlement. Kaiser growled low in his throat, and Tansie stood up, positioning herself between the approaching group and the suffering dog. 3 men rounded the corner. The first was Clinton Deare, and seeing him after all these years was like a punch to the gut. He'd aged well, his dark hair now distinguished with grey at the temples, his face more lined but still handsome. He wore an expensive black suit that looked absurdly out of place in Gable's pass, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Behind him walked 2 men in security uniforms, hired muscle trying to look professional. Clinton stopped when he saw her, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, recognition, then something harder to read. "Tansie Bellford," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it. "I heard you were still around, living up in the mountains like some kind of hermit." "Clinton," she said evenly. "Your dog is hurt." He glanced at Rex dismissively. "He's fine, just getting old. Sometimes he wanders off." "He's not fine," Tansie said. "His ears have been traumatized. Recently, someone did something to him." Clinton's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold. "I appreciate your concern, but Rex is my dog, and I'll handle his care. Now if you'll excuse us." "No," Tansie said. The word came out flat and final. "Not until I understand what's been done to him." The 2 security men moved forward slightly, a silent threat. Kaiser growled louder, his hackles rising. The tension in the alley thickened, and Tansie felt the old familiar feeling, the clarity that came before action, the calm assessment of threat levels and response options. Clinton raised a hand, stopping his security. He looked at Tansie for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes she didn't like, a calculation, a measuring of risk versus benefit. "You always did have a soft spot for strays," he said finally. "Fine. Take a look if it'll make you feel better. But then you leave him alone." Tansie knelt again, and this time she examined Rex's ears more carefully. What she found made her blood run cold. Buried in the swollen tissue of each ear was something small and hard, electronic, she was certain. Not medical implants, devices, deliberately placed. She looked up at Clinton, and he met her gaze steadily. "What is this?" she asked quietly. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Clinton said. "Now step away from my dog." But Tansie had already seen enough. She knew what surveillance tech looked like. She'd seen it used in combat zones, in villages where they needed to monitor enemy movement. This was the same thing, miniaturized and implanted in an animal. The question was why? She stood up slowly, never taking her eyes off Clinton. "I'm taking him to a vet." "No," Clinton said, and now his voice held an edge. "You're not. Rex is my property, and you're trespassing. Leave. Now." The security men moved closer. Tansie calculated odds. She could take them both if necessary. Her training was still sharp, but that would create problems, legal problems she didn't need. So instead, she pulled out her phone and took a picture of Rex, his swollen ears clearly visible. "What are you doing?" Clinton demanded. "Documentation," Tansie said, "in case something happens to him." Clinton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He gestured to his security, and one of them bent down to pick up Rex. The dog whimpered but didn't resist, too weak or too trained to fight. They carried him away, Clinton following, but at the corner he turned back. "Stay out of things that don't concern you, Tansie," he said. "You're nobody here. You gave up the right to care about this town a long time ago." Then they were gone, leaving her alone in the alley with Kaiser, and a growing sense that she'd just stumbled into something far darker than she'd imagined. Tansie stood in the alley for a long moment after Clinton and his men disappeared, her heart pounding with an adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. Kaiser pressed against her leg, sensing her distress. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down, to think clearly. Something was very wrong here, and her instincts that had kept her alive through 2 tours in combat zones, were screaming at her to pay attention. She went into the general store through the back door. Jolene was behind the counter, ringing up a tourist's purchase of local honey and postcards. When she saw Tansie's face, she frowned slightly, but waited until the customer left before speaking. "You look like you've seen trouble," Jolene said. "I just ran into Clinton Deare out back," Tansie said, keeping her voice low. "His dog was hurt. Badly." Jolene's expression shifted to something more guarded. "Rex? That old K9 of his. You know the dog. Everyone knows Rex. Clinton got him a few years back from some police auction or something. Likes to show him off. Talks about the dog's training, his value." "What happened?" "Someone put something in his ears. Electronic devices, embedded in the tissue. Made him sick." Jolene went very still. She glanced toward the front windows, checking for customers, then leaned forward. "Tansie, I don't know what you think you saw, but you need to be careful. Clinton Deare isn't the boy you knew in high school. He's powerful now, connected. People don't cross him." "What do you mean, people don't cross him?" Jolene hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Things have changed in Gable's Pass. You've been up in the mountains, so maybe you haven't noticed. But in the last 5 years or so, Clinton's brought in outside money, development. Some people appreciate it. New businesses, jobs. But others—" She stopped, shaking her head. "People who get in his way tend to have bad luck." "What kind of bad luck?" "The kind where their businesses fail, or they decide to move away suddenly. Nothing you can prove, understand? Just patterns. I run a store, Tansie. I see things, hear things. And what I've learned is to keep my head down and my mouth shut." Tansie studied her friend's face and saw genuine fear there. "Jolene, what's really going on?" Before Jolene could answer, the bell above the front door chimed. A man in uniform entered. Deputy Randall Kemp, a local officer Tansie vaguely remembered from her youth. He'd been a few years behind her in school. Now he was in his mid-40s, carrying a bit of weight, but still solid, with a weathered face and tired eyes. "Afternoon, Jolene," he said, then noticed Tansie. "Miss Bellford, don't see you in town much." "Just here for supplies," Tansie said carefully. Kemp nodded, but his eyes were sharp. "Heard there was some commotion in the alley. Mayor's dog got loose or something?" "The dog was hurt," Tansie said. "I tried to help." "Uh-huh. And the mayor asked you to leave it alone, I'm guessing." "Something like that." Kemp sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, I'm going to give you some advice. Same advice I'd give anyone. Don't make trouble. Clinton Deare is the mayor. He's got resources and friends, and stirring things up won't end well for you." "Is that a threat, Deputy?" "It's a warning, a friendly one. You live up in those mountains away from all this, and that's probably for the best. Stay up there." He tipped his hat to Jolene and left, the bell chiming again. Tansie watched him go, her jaw tight. "Everyone in this town scared of Clinton Deare?" "Not scared," Jolene said quietly, just realistic. Now, are you buying supplies or not? Because I've got inventory to do. Tansie gathered what she needed, paid in cash the way she always did, and loaded the supplies into her truck. But she couldn't shake the image of Rex's suffering eyes, couldn't stop thinking about those devices embedded in his ears. She sat in the truck for a long moment, Kaiser in the passenger seat, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to drive back to the trailhead, hike home, and forget this ever happened. She'd built a life predicated on not getting involved, on keeping her distance from people and their problems. It was safer that way, cleaner. She'd earned her solitude, earned the right to live in peace after everything she'd been through. But she couldn't stop seeing Rex's eyes. She pulled out her phone and looked at the picture she'd taken. Even in the photo, you could see the swelling, the unnatural shapes under the skin. She zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as her phone would allow. The devices were small, sophisticated, military-grade or close to it. This wasn't some amateur operation. Tansie started the truck and drove, not back toward the trailhead, but deeper into town, past Main Street to the residential areas. She parked on a quiet side street and opened her laptop, an old ruggedized model she kept for emergencies. She had satellite internet at the cabin, minimal but functional, and she'd set up her phone as a hotspot for situations like this. She uploaded the photo to her laptop and opened image analysis software she'd learned to use during her military service. The devices in Rex's ears had distinctive shapes, specific configurations. She ran them through a database of known surveillance equipment, expecting nothing but hoping for something. 20 minutes later, she had a match. The devices were Chinese-made, available on the black market, designed for covert audio surveillance. They required surgical implantation and transmitted encrypted signals to a nearby receiver. Battery life of approximately 6 months. Removal required medical expertise. Tansie sat back, processing this information. Why would anyone implant surveillance devices in a dog? The obvious answer was to monitor the dog's environment, to listen to conversations happening around it. But Rex was Clinton's dog, living in Clinton's house. Unless Rex went places Clinton couldn't, or places where people spoke freely around a dog but wouldn't around the mayor. She thought about small-town dynamics, about how a mayor's dog might be welcomed into homes, businesses, places where a mayor himself wouldn't be invited. An elderly resident's home, a closed business meeting, a private conversation between residents who didn't trust the mayor. A dog was invisible in ways a person never could be. It was brilliant in a twisted way, and it was deeply illegal. Tansie closed her laptop and sat in her truck, staring out at the quiet street. Children rode bicycles past, their laughter carrying on the afternoon air. An elderly couple walked arm in arm. Normal life, innocent and oblivious. And underneath it, surveillance, manipulation, control. She thought about Jolene's words. People who got in Clinton's way had bad luck. If he was spying on the entire town, he'd know everything. Who was planning to oppose him? Who was talking about him? What weaknesses he could exploit? No wonder he'd become so powerful. Kaiser whined softly, sensing her agitation. She scratched his ears absently, her mind working through the problem. She had evidence. The photo, the analysis. But she had no authority here, no standing. She was just a recluse who'd spent 15 years hiding from the world. Who would believe her? Who would even listen? Deputy Kemp had essentially told her to go home and mind her business. Jolene was too scared to help. The sheriff's office was small, probably compromised. State police were hours away and would need more than a photo to investigate a sitting mayor. She could walk away. Should walk away. This wasn't her problem, wasn't a town anymore. She'd given up the right to care about Gable's Pass when she'd abandoned it for the mountains. But then she thought about the young soldiers she'd tried to save in desert field hospitals, about the promises she'd made to herself, about standing for something, about not letting evil go unchallenged just because challenging it was hard. Tansie started the truck and drove back to Main Street. She parked in front of the old mining office, the abandoned building at the end of the street. Something about it had caught her attention earlier. Something wrong that her subconscious had noted, but her conscious mind had missed. She looked at it now with trained eyes. The windows were boarded up, yes, but the boards were new, recently installed. The historical marker out front was clean, well maintained, and on the roof, was that a satellite dish? Partially hidden behind the false front, but visible if you knew where to look. An abandoned building with new security and satellite communications. Tansie felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place, a picture emerging that she didn't like at all. She took more photos, documenting everything from multiple angles. Then she sat in her truck and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going back to the mountains. Not yet. Not until she understood what Clinton Deare was really doing to this town. Kaiser leaned against her, and she buried her fingers in his fur. "I know, boy," she said quietly. "I know this is a bad idea. But some things you can't just walk away from." She pulled out her phone and started making calls, first to a veterinarian friend from her military days, someone who owed her a favor and wouldn't ask too many questions. She sent him the photos of Rex, asked for analysis and recommendations. Then she called her former commanding officer, left a message asking about surveillance technology and legal protocols. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when Tansie finally drove back to the trailhead. She had supplies to carry up, and the hike would take 3 hours in fading light. But her mind was already working, already planning. She'd spent 15 years running away from conflict, from involvement, from caring too much. Maybe it was time to stop running. 3 days passed before Tansie returned to Gable's Pass. 3 days spent in her cabin, researching on her laptop, making calls, and trying to convince herself she wasn't making a terrible mistake. The veterinarian friend confirmed what she suspected. The devices in Rex's ears were surveillance equipment, and their placement would have required someone with surgical training. The pain Rex was experiencing came from infection setting in around the implants, a common complication when foreign objects were inserted into living tissue without proper sterile protocols. Her former commanding officer hadn't called back, which probably meant he was deployed or didn't want to get involved. Tansie couldn't blame him. She barely wanted to be involved herself. But she kept thinking about Rex's eyes, about the fear in Jolene's voice, about the way Deputy Kemp had warned her off. A town living under surveillance, under control, and nobody willing to speak up. It reminded her of places she'd been overseas, villages where warlords held power through intimidation and information. She'd hated those places, hated watching people live in fear. On the 4th morning, she packed a different kind of kit, her old tactical vest, binoculars, a camera with a telephoto lens, and her service weapon, a Beretta M9 she'd kept even after discharge. She didn't plan to use it, but going unarmed into a surveillance operation seemed foolish. Kaiser stayed home this time. What she was planning required stealth, and a German shepherd, however well trained, would draw attention. She drove to town in the early afternoon, parking 3 blocks from Main Street in a residential area where her truck wouldn't stand out. She'd changed her appearance slightly, wore a sun hat and different clothes, Nothing dramatic, but enough that casual observers might not immediately recognize her as the mountain woman from a few days ago. Her target was the old mining office. If her suspicions were correct, that building was the hub of Clinton's surveillance network. The satellite dish on the roof suggested data transmission. The new security suggested something worth protecting. She needed to get inside to see what was really happening. But first, she needed information about the building's current status. Who owned it? Who had access? What legitimate reason could Clinton have for maintaining it? The town clerk's office was in the municipal building, a modest structure 2 blocks off Main Street. Tansie walked in like she belonged there, like she had every right to be searching public records. The clerk, a young woman in her 20s, barely looked up from her computer. "Help you?" she asked. "Property records," Tansie said. "I'm researching the old mining office building for a historical project." "Computers over there," the clerk said, gesturing to a public terminal in the corner. "Tax records and ownership are all digital now. If you need archived documents, those are in the basement, but you'll need to fill out a request form." Tansie sat at the computer and began searching. The mining office building was owned by something called Bitterroot Development LLC, registered 5 years ago. Principal officer, Clinton Deare. She dug deeper, following corporate filings and tax records. Bitterroot Development owned several properties in and around Gable's Pass, commercial buildings, vacant land, even a few residential properties that had been purchased in the last 3 years. She pulled up the county assessor's maps and saw a pattern. The properties formed a cluster in the northeastern part of town, all adjacent or nearby. Someone was assembling land parcels, preparing for development, or preparing for something else. Tansie photographed the screen with her phone, documenting everything. Then she searched for recent building permits. Bitterroot Development had pulled permits for renovations and repairs on the mining office 6 months ago. The work was listed as interior upgrades and electrical system modernization. No details beyond that, and the permits had been approved without the usual inspections that historic buildings required. "Finding what you need?" the clerk asked. "Yes, thank you," Tansie said, logging out. She left the municipal building and walked toward Main Street, her mind processing what she'd learned. Clinton was using a shell company to buy up property, and he'd renovated the mining office without proper oversight. The pieces were fitting together, but the picture was still incomplete. She needed to talk to people, but carefully. She couldn't just walk up to residents and start asking about the mayor. Word would get back to Clinton immediately, especially if he really was monitoring the town. She needed someone who might talk, someone with grievances or concerns. Jolene was the obvious choice, but Tansie didn't want to put her friend in danger. Instead, she headed to the Silver Claim, the bar on Main Street. Bars were where people talked, where information flowed more freely than in daylight conversations. It was 3 in the afternoon, not crowded yet, just a few regulars nursing beers. Tansie ordered coffee from the bartender, an older man with a weathered face and the knowing eyes of someone who'd seen everything. She sat at the bar, not hiding but not advertising her presence either, just another person passing through. "You're not from around here," the bartender said. It wasn't a question. "Used to be," Tansie said. "Grew up here, actually. Been gone a long time." "Yeah? What brings you back?" "Just visiting, seeing how the place has changed." The bartender grunted. "Changed plenty. Not all for the better, if you ask me." Tansie took a sip of coffee, waiting. People wanted to talk, especially when they thought they were talking to a stranger. The bartender wiped down the bar, then leaned forward slightly. "Town's not what it was," he said quietly. "Used to be you knew everybody. Everybody looked out for each other. Now it's all tourism and development. Old families getting pushed out, businesses closing. Mayor says it's progress. Some of us aren't so sure. What kind of businesses closed? Tansie asked. The hardware store, for one. Old man Phillips ran that place for 40 years. Then his building got condemned. Electrical issues, they said. Repairs would have cost more than he could afford. Had to sell to some development company. Same thing happened to the bookstore, the leather shop, couple of others. All condemned? Or bad luck? Phillips's daughter says her dad got a visit from the mayor. Pressure to sell. When he refused, suddenly inspectors found problems. The bartender shook his head. But that's just talk. Can't prove nothing. Tansie absorbed this, another piece falling into place. What about the old mining office? That building at the end of Main Street? The bartender's expression shifted, became more guarded. What about it? Just curious. Looks like it's been fixed up. Mayor's project. Says he's turning it into a heritage museum or something. But nobody's allowed inside, and there's security. Seems strange for a museum. Before Tansie could respond, the door opened, and Deputy Kemp walked in. His eyes found Tansie immediately, and his expression hardened. He walked over, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. "Miss Bellford," he said. "Thought you'd headed back to the mountains." "Just having coffee," Tansie said evenly. "Uh-huh. Got a minute? I'd like to talk to you outside." It wasn't a request. Tansie stood, leaving money on the bar, and followed Kemp out to the sidewalk. He led her around the corner, away from the windows, and turned to face her. "What are you doing?" he asked, and his voice held frustration more than anger. "Exercising my rights as a citizen. You're digging into things that are going to get you hurt. I told you to leave it alone. And I told you there's something wrong with that dog, with this whole town." Kemp looked around, checking for observers, then stepped closer. "Listen to me carefully. I know you think you're helping, but you're not. You're going to make things worse for everyone, including yourself. Go home, Tansie. Please." "Why?" Tansie asked. "What are you afraid of?" For a moment, she thought he might actually tell her. She saw conflict in his eyes, the struggle of a man who'd taken an oath to serve and protect, but found himself unable to do either. Then he shook his head. "I've got a family," he said quietly. "2 kids, wife who depends on my income. I can't afford to be a hero. Neither can you." He walked away, leaving Tansie standing on the empty sidewalk with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that whatever Clinton Deare was doing, it had this entire town paralyzed with fear. Tansie waited until well after midnight before approaching the mining office. She'd spent the evening in her truck, parked in different locations around town, observing patterns. Security guards changed shift at 8 and again at midnight. During the changeover, there was a brief window, maybe 5 minutes, when coverage wasn't perfect. That would have to be enough. She'd changed into dark clothing, practical gear from her military days. The tactical vest held tools she'd need, lockpicks, a flashlight with a red filter, her camera, and her sidearm. She moved through the shadows along Main Street, keeping to the spaces between streetlights, using the skills that had kept her alive in hostile territory. The mining office loomed against the night sky, 3 stories of brick and history. Up close, she could see the security cameras mounted at the corners, the new locks on the doors, the reinforced frames. This wasn't casual security. This was serious protection for something valuable. Tansie circled the building, staying out of camera range, looking for weaknesses. The ground floor windows were boarded and likely alarmed. The back door was steel, recently installed. But there, on the west side, partially hidden by an overgrown hedge, was an old coal chute, probably from when the building had been heated by a furnace. The metal door was rusted, forgotten in the renovation. She worked quickly, using a pry bar to lever the coal chute door open. The metal groaned softly, but gave way. The opening was tight, maybe 20 inches wide, but Tansie was lean and flexible. She squeezed through, dropping 6 feet into what had once been the basement boiler room. Her flashlight revealed a space that had been cleared out. Concrete floor swept clean, new electrical conduits running along the ceiling. She could hear the hum of equipment somewhere above her, the electronic purr of computers and cooling systems. The basement stairs were locked from above, but the lock was old, original to the building. Her picks made quick work of it. She climbed carefully, testing each step for creaks, moving with the patience of someone who'd infiltrated enemy compounds. The first floor was dark, empty of furniture but full of equipment. Her flashlight beam caught rows of server racks, blinking lights indicating active systems. Monitors lined one wall, currently dark but clearly functional. This was a data center, sophisticated and expensive. Tansie moved to the monitors and pressed a key on one keyboard. The screens flickered to life, showing a login screen protected by password. She'd expected that. Instead, she photographed everything: the equipment models, the network cables, the configuration. She found paperwork on a desk, carefully photographed each page: contracts, technical specifications, network diagrams. What she was seeing shocked her, even as it confirmed her worst suspicions. This wasn't just a surveillance hub for Gable's pass. The network diagrams showed connections extending throughout the county, maybe beyond. Equipment manifests listed dozens of surveillance devices, not just audio implants like the ones in Rex, but cameras, microphones, tracking devices. She found a map on the wall marked with pins, properties throughout the area, each pin coded by color. Red pins, clustered in one section, all properties that appeared to be targeted for acquisition. Blue pins marked properties already owned by Bitterroot Development. The pattern was clear: systematic acquisition of land in a specific corridor, all leading toward the national forest boundary. Why would Clinton need to spy on people to buy land? Unless he was using the surveillance to find leverage, to discover secrets he could exploit, to pressure people into selling below market value. Tansie was photographing the map when she heard voices outside, security guards making their rounds early, or maybe responding to an alarm she'd triggered. She had maybe 2 minutes before they entered the building. She moved quickly back toward the basement stairs, but footsteps were already coming through the front door. She couldn't go back the way she'd come. Instead, she headed deeper into the building, toward the back stairs she'd seen on the floor plans in the clerk's office. The back stairwell was dark, original to the building, probably not renovated. She climbed to the second floor, then the third, looking for another way out. The third floor was storage, old mining equipment, archived records, dust-covered furniture, and a window, not boarded, overlooking the alley. She could hear security guards below now, their voices echoing through the building. They'd found the coal chute, knew someone was inside. She had minutes at best. The window was painted shut, but her knife made quick work of that. She forced it open, looked down at a 20-foot drop to the alley below. No fire escape, no easy way down. But there was a drain pipe, old cast iron that might hold her weight. Tansie didn't hesitate. She climbed out the window, gripped the drain pipe, and started down. The metal groaned under her weight, but held. She was 10 feet from the ground when the pipe's bracket pulled free from the brick. She fell, landed hard on her side, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then survival instinct kicked in. She forced herself up, pain shooting through her ribs, and ran. Behind her, She heard shouts, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. She made it to the shadows, then to her truck, and drove away before security could reach the alley. She didn't go back to the trailhead. Instead, she drove to a small motel on the edge of town, paid cash for a room, and locked herself inside. Only then did she allow herself to assess the damage. Bruised ribs, possibly cracked, scraped hands and arms. Nothing critical, but she'd be hurting for days. She uploaded all the photos from her camera to her laptop, then to encrypted cloud storage with copies sent to multiple secure email addresses. Insurance, in case something happened to her. Then she looked through what she'd captured, piecing together the full picture. Clinton Deare was running a surveillance operation across the entire county. He was using that intelligence to systematically acquire property, building toward something bigger. The land corridor on the map led toward national forest, toward mining claims that had been dormant for decades. And then she saw it, in one of the documents she'd photographed, a geological survey report dated 6 months ago. It detailed rare earth mineral deposits, the kind used in electronics, military applications, renewable energy technology. The deposits were massive, potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And they sat directly under the properties Clinton was acquiring. He wasn't just a corrupt mayor. He was orchestrating a resource grab, using surveillance and intimidation to force people off land that would make him wealthy beyond imagination. The surveillance of Rex and probably other animals was just the beginning, a test before deploying human surveillance on a wider scale. Tansie sat on the motel bed, her laptop in front of her, evidence of massive criminal conspiracy documented in digital files. She should turn this over to authorities, state police, FBI, someone with jurisdiction and resources. But she'd learned in the military that sometimes official channels were slow, bureaucratic, compromised. And while she waited for official investigations, how many more people would be forced from their homes? How many more would suffer under Clinton's surveillance and manipulation? Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "I know it was you at the mining office. Last chance to walk away. Next time I won't be so gentle." Tansie looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She'd never been good at walking away from fights, even when she should. Especially when she should. She took pain medication from her first aid kit, lay down on the motel bed, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd figure out her next move. Tonight she'd acknowledge what she'd known from the moment she'd knelt beside that suffering dog. She was in this now, all the way, and there was no going back. Tansie woke to pounding on the motel room door. Dawn light filtered through the thin curtains, and her ribs screamed with pain as she rolled out of bed. She grabbed her weapon, moved to the side of the door. "Who is it?" "Deputy Kemp, open up." She considered her options, then unlocked the door but kept the chain engaged, peering through the gap. Kemp stood alone, in uniform, looking tired and frustrated. "You alone?" she asked. "Yeah. Can I come in?" She let him in, closed the door, and stood with her back to the wall, weapon lowered but ready. Kemp saw it and raised his hand slightly. "I'm not here to arrest you," he said, "though I probably should. Breaking and entering, trespassing, self-defense," Tansie said. "I felt threatened." "Right." Kemp rubbed his face. The mining office security found evidence of intrusion. Nothing was taken, but someone was definitely inside. Clinton's furious, demanding we find whoever did it. "And you came here because you're the only person in this town crazy enough to do something like that. And because," he stopped, seemed to struggle with something, Because I need to know what you found. Tansie studied him for a long moment. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. I haven't given you any reason to. But I'm asking anyway. He moved to the window, looked out at the parking lot. I've been a deputy here for 15 years. I took an oath to protect this community. And for the last 5 years, I've watched it get corrupted, twisted into something I don't recognize. I've done nothing because I was scared. Scared for my job, my family, my safety. I'm still scared, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine. What changed? You did. You came back, started asking questions, and it reminded me that some things are worth the risk. He turned to face her. So I'm asking, what did you find in that building? Tansie made a decision. She pulled out her laptop, opened the encrypted files, and showed him everything. The surveillance equipment, the property maps, the geological survey, the evidence of systematic intimidation and land acquisition. Kemp's face went pale as he scrolled through the photos. Jesus Christ, I knew things were bad, but not this bad. He's been spying on the entire town, Tansie said, using that information to pressure people, to find leverage. The rare earth deposits are worth a fortune, and he's using every illegal method he can to acquire the land above them. We need to take this to the state police, Kemp said. The FBI. This is way beyond local jurisdiction. I already sent copies to both, Tansie said. Anonymous tips with all the evidence. But official investigations take time. Months, maybe years. How many people will Clinton destroy while we wait for bureaucracy? Kemp closed the laptop, sat down heavily on the motel bed. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we need to force his hand. Make this public now, before he can cover his tracks or intimidate more people. How? Town meeting. Next week. I saw it posted at the municipal building. Clinton's presenting some kind of development proposal. What if someone else presented first? What if the whole town saw what he's been doing? He'd never allow it. He controls the meeting, the agenda. He controls it because nobody's challenged him. Because everyone's too afraid. But what if they weren't? What if enough people stood together? Kemp shook his head. You don't understand how scared people are. The Phillips family, the Johnsons, the Kowalskis, they all lost their businesses or their homes. Everyone saw what happened to them. Nobody wants to be next. Then we need to show them they're not alone, that there's evidence, that we can fight this. Tansie leaned forward, despite the pain in her ribs. You know these people, Kemp. You know who's been hurt by Clinton's schemes. Help me reach them. If I do this, I lose my job, probably get blacklisted from law enforcement in this entire state. Maybe. Or maybe you become the deputy who stood up to corruption when it mattered. Tansie held his gaze. I know about being afraid. I spent 15 years hiding in the mountains because I was too scared to face the world. But at some point, you have to decide what you stand for. Kemp sat in silence for a long moment. Then he pulled out a small notebook and started writing names. These are people who've been hurt by Clinton's development schemes. Some might talk to you if I introduce you. Some won't. But it's a start. Over the next 3 days, Tansie and Kemp worked carefully and quietly. They met with affected residents in their homes, always with curtains drawn, voices low. Tansie showed them the evidence, explained what Clinton was really doing. Some were skeptical. Some were too frightened to act. But a few, just a few, were angry enough to listen. Old Phillips, who'd lost his hardware store, sat in his living room and wept as he looked at the surveillance evidence. I thought I was going crazy, he said. Thought it was just bad luck. But he knew about my financial troubles, knew exactly what to say to break me. Mary Johnson, whose family ranch had been condemned for environmental violations that appeared in the files as falsified, held Tansie's hand with a grip like iron. "Tell me what to do," she said. "Tell me how to fight." By the end of the third day, they had 14 people willing to stand up at the town meeting. Not enough to fill the hall, but enough to make noise, to demand answers, to show others they weren't alone. But they needed more than angry residents. They needed someone with credibility, someone the town would listen to. That's when Kemp suggested Jolene. "She's respected," he said. "Been here her whole life, runs an honest business, never takes sides. If she speaks up, people will pay attention." Tansie went to see Jolene at the general store, after hours when no one else was around. She showed her everything, every photo, every document, every piece of evidence. Jolene sat behind her counter, her face growing harder with each revelation. "I knew he was dirty," Jolene said finally. "But this is evil. Systematic, calculated evil." "Will you help?" Tansie asked. Jolene was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. "I'm 62 years old. I was going to retire next year. Sell this store, live on my savings. If I stand against Clinton, he'll destroy me, condemn my building, ruin my reputation, make sure I can't sell. I know. I wouldn't ask if there was another way. But if I don't stand against him, I have to live with myself, have to look in the mirror and know I let a tyrant run this town into the ground because I was too scared to fight." Jolene looked up, and her eyes were fierce. "My husband was a Marine. He used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, despite the fear. I guess it's time I lived up to that." That night, Tansie drove back to her cabin for the first time in a week. Kaiser greeted her with joy, and she buried her face in his fur, letting herself feel the weight of what she'd set in motion. 4 days until the town meeting. 4 days to prepare for a confrontation that could save this town or destroy everyone involved. She sat on her porch as darkness fell, looking out at the mountains that had been her refuge for so long. Soon she'd have to leave them again, walk back into the world, risk everything for a town that had never particularly wanted her. But maybe that was the point. Maybe courage meant standing up for people, even when they hadn't stood up for you. Maybe redemption looked like fighting for a place you'd abandoned. The pressure started 2 days before the town meeting. Phillips received a visit from Clinton's lawyer, threatening a lawsuit for slander if he made false accusations. Mary Johnson found her ranch's water supply mysteriously contaminated, requiring expensive testing and remediation. 2 of the 14 residents who'd agreed to speak up suddenly changed their minds, citing family concerns. Tansie watched the resistance crumble in real time, watched fear do what it always did, paralyze good people. She sat in the motel room with Kemp and Jolene, discussing options. "We're down to 11 people willing to speak," Kemp said, "and those 11 are terrified. If we don't give them something more, some protection, some assurance this won't destroy them, we'll lose them too." "What about the state police?" Jolene asked. "Did they respond to your tip?" "I called them yesterday," Tansie said. "They're interested but moving slowly. Standard procedure. They need to verify the evidence, build a case, coordinate with federal agencies. They're talking weeks, maybe months." "We don't have weeks," Kemp said. "The town meeting is in 2 days. Clinton's going to push through his development proposal, and once that's approved, it becomes much harder to stop him legally." Tansie pulled out her laptop and opened a file she'd been working on. "Then we need to change our approach. Instead of just showing evidence at the meeting, We need to make it impossible for Clinton to dismiss or suppress. We need to go public first. Send the evidence to journalists, post it online, make sure it's out there before the meeting even starts. That's risky, Jolene said. Once it's public, we can't control the narrative. Clinton has resources, lawyers, connections. He could spin it as conspiracy theories, discredit us before anyone takes it seriously. Maybe, but at least it would be out there. At least people would know. Tansie looked at her two unlikely allies. I've been thinking about something Deputy Kemp said, that Clinton has been doing this for 5 years, and nobody's stopped him because everyone's isolated. Everyone thinks they're alone. What if we changed that? What if we showed the whole town, right now, that they're not alone? How? Kemp asked. Social media, local news, a website dedicated to documenting everything Clinton's done. We post the evidence, the stories, the names of people he's hurt. We do it anonymously at first, so no single person can be targeted. But we make it impossible to ignore. Over the next 12 hours, they worked frantically. Jolene reached out to her network of long-time residents, gathering stories and testimonials. Kemp provided official documentation, reports he'd filed that had been suppressed, complaints that had disappeared, evidence he'd been told to ignore. Tansie compiled everything into a comprehensive website, hosted on servers outside the country, anonymous and untraceable. They called it Gable's Past Truth. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. The website laid out everything: the surveillance operation, the land grab, the intimidation, the rare earth deposits. Every claim was backed by documentation, photographs, official records. They included a timeline showing the systematic destruction of local businesses and the acquisition of their properties. They posted audio recordings Kemp had made of conversations with residents describing threats and pressure. At midnight, Tansie pressed the button to make the website live. Then she posted links on every local Facebook group, every community forum, every social media platform she could find. She sent the link to the county newspaper, to regional TV stations, to investigative journalists who specialized in corruption cases. Within an hour, the website had been viewed 200 times. By morning, over 1,000. The local newspaper called Jolene's store, asking for comment. A TV station from Missoula sent a reporter. The county sheriff, Clinton's ally, issued a statement calling the website malicious lies by disgruntled individuals. But the truth was out, and once truth is loose, it's very hard to contain. Tansie was in her motel room when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize, but with a local area code. She answered cautiously. Tansie Bellford. A woman's voice, older, unfamiliar. Who's asking? My name is Patricia Voss. I'm a colonel in the U.S. Army, and I need to speak with you immediately. Tansie felt ice in her stomach. Colonel Voss, her former commanding officer, the one she'd tried to reach weeks ago. I'm listening. Not on the phone. There's a diner called Mountain View on Highway 93 south of town. Meet me there in 1 hour. Come alone. The line went dead. Tansie sat holding her phone, processing this development. Military involvement meant complications, meant jurisdictions and protocols she'd been trying to avoid. But it might also mean resources, protection, legitimacy. She drove to the diner, checking her mirrors for tails, taking an indirect route. The Mountain View was a classic roadside stop. Chrome and vinyl, truckers and travelers. Colonel Voss sat in a back booth, in civilian clothes, but unmistakable in her bearing. She was in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. Sit, Voss said. Not a greeting, just a command. Tansie sat. You've created quite a mess, Voss said. I've exposed quite a mess, Tansie corrected. There's a difference. Is there? From where I sit, you've compromised an ongoing federal investigation, alerted targets to surveillance, and potentially endangered undercover assets. Tansie felt the words land like punches. What investigation? Voss pulled out a tablet, showed Tansie a classified briefing document. Clinton Deare has been under federal investigation for 14 months, not just for local corruption, for connections to an international smuggling ring dealing in rare earth minerals and illegal surveillance technology. The surveillance operation in Gable's Pass is small scale compared to what he's involved in overseas. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because you're not supposed to be involved. You're a civilian now, Bellford. You should have reported your suspicions and stepped back. While people suffered? While a town got destroyed? That's not acceptable. Voss leaned back, studying her. You always were stubborn. That's why you were a good medic. You never gave up on anyone, even when you should have. But this isn't a battlefield. This is a complex criminal investigation with international implications. So what now? You shut down the website? Suppress the truth? No, it's too late for that. You've forced our hand. Voss's expression softened slightly. The good news is that your evidence is solid, very solid. We'd already assembled most of it, but you've connected pieces we'd missed. The website has accelerated our timeline. Meaning? Meaning we're moving on Clinton now. Federal marshals are en route. We'll arrest him tomorrow morning on RICO charges, racketeering, conspiracy, illegal surveillance, smuggling. The whole operation gets shut down. Tansie should have felt relief, but something nagged at her. What about the town meeting? What about it? The people who stood up, who agreed to speak out. They deserve their moment. They deserve to face him publicly, to reclaim their power. Voss shook her head. Once he's arrested, the meeting won't happen. Then arrest him after. Give the town one day to stand up for itself. One day to remember what it means to fight back. That's not how this works. Please. Tansie leaned forward. These people have been living in fear for 5 years. They need to see him fall, need to be part of his defeat. If federal agents just swoop in and arrest him, they'll always feel like victims. Let them be victors, just for a moment. Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. You're asking me to delay a federal arrest for symbolic reasons. I'm asking you to let people have their dignity back. 24 hours, Voss said finally. The meeting is tomorrow evening. We'll position teams nearby, ready to move if things go wrong. But if he tries to run, if there's any indication he's destroying evidence, we move immediately. Understood. Voss stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Bellford, you did good work. Reckless, unauthorized, technically illegal work. But good. After she left, Tansie sat in the diner booth, drinking cold coffee, watching trucks roll past on the highway. Tomorrow would be the day, the confrontation she'd been building toward since the moment she'd knelt beside that suffering dog. She thought about Clinton, about the boy she'd loved, and the man he'd become. Somewhere along the way, ambition had turned to greed, and greed to cruelty. Tomorrow she'd face him one last time, not with nostalgia, but with justice. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jolene. 14 residents back on board. They saw the website, saw the national attention. They want to speak tomorrow. Tansie smiled. Fear was powerful, but hope backed by truth, was stronger. The morning of the town meeting dawned clear and cold. Tansie woke in her motel room to find 3 new voicemails on her phone. The first was from a regional news station, requesting an interview. The second was from the county attorney's office, threatening legal action for defamatory content on the website. The third made her blood run cold. It was Clinton Deare's voice, calm and measured. "Tansie, I think it's time we talked, just the two of us, before this gets any more out of hand. Meet me at the old fire lookout on Bitterroot Ridge. Noon. Come alone, and we can settle this without anyone else getting hurt." The message had been left at 3 a.m. Tansie checked the time. It was already 10:30. She called Kemp immediately. "Don't go," he said, as soon as she told him. "It's a trap. He'll either hurt you or stage something to discredit you. Maybe. Or maybe he wants to negotiate. Either way, I need to hear what he has to say." "Then let me come with you, or at least wear a wire. He'll check for that. And if he sees anyone else, he'll just leave." Tansie was already gathering her gear. "I'll be careful, and I'll be armed. If I'm not back by 2, send everyone. Police, feds, the cavalry." The fire lookout was an hour's drive into the mountains, then a 2-mile hike on a narrow trail. Tansie made it with 20 minutes to spare, approaching cautiously, checking for ambush. The lookout was a wooden tower, 40 feet high, with a small cabin at the top where fire spotters once watched for smoke during dry summers. It had been abandoned for years, maintained only as a historical landmark. Clinton stood at the base of the tower, alone, dressed in jeans and a casual jacket, the most informal she'd ever seen him. He looked tired, older than his years, and when he saw her, something like relief crossed his face. "You came," he said. "Did you expect me not to?" "I didn't know. The Tansie I knew was predictable. The woman who broke into my building and destroyed my operation, I don't know her at all." They stood 10 feet apart, and the air between them felt charged with history and hurt. Tansie kept her hand near her weapon, but didn't draw it. "Why did you want to meet?" she asked. "To give you context, to explain what you don't understand." "I understand plenty. You've been spying on this town, manipulating people, destroying lives to get rich off mineral deposits." "Is that what you think?" Clinton laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That this is about money? About greed? What else would it be about?" He climbed the stairs of the tower, gesturing for her to follow. Against her better judgment, she did. At the top, the view stretched for miles. Mountains, forest, the town of Gable's Pass, small and vulnerable in the valley below. "You left?" Clinton said, staring out at the landscape. 35 years ago, you left this place, left me, to go be a hero. You came back, broken, and hid in these mountains. But I stayed. I watched this town die slowly, year after year. Businesses closing, young people leaving, hope draining away like water from a cracked basin. So you decided to speed up the process? I decided to save it. He turned to face her, and his eyes held conviction she hadn't expected. Those mineral deposits are worth $300 million, enough to transform Gable's Pass from a dying tourist trap into a real town again. Jobs, infrastructure, futures for kids who would otherwise have to leave. By forcing people from their homes, by convincing them to accept fair market value for property that would otherwise be worthless. The surveillance, yes, it's aggressive, borderline illegal, but it's necessary. People are irrational, Tansie. They hold on to failing businesses out of sentiment, refuse to sell land out of stubbornness, vote against their own interests. Sometimes you have to guide them to make the right choice. Guide them? Tansie's voice rose. You implanted surveillance devices in your own dog. You fabricated building violations. You've terrorized this entire community. I've saved it. This town was dying, and now it has a chance. Yes, some people had to sacrifice. That's how progress works. You of all people should understand that. You were a combat medic. You made triage decisions, chose who to save and who to let die. How is this different? The comparison hit Tansie like a physical blow. Those were battlefield decisions, life and death. And this is economic life and death. Towns die too, Tansie. And when they do, everyone suffers. The old folks who can't afford to move, the kids who inherit poverty, the community that just fades away. I'm trying to prevent that. For a moment, just a moment, Tansie could see his logic, could understand how a young man's ambition and a dying town's desperation could twist into something that looked almost noble from certain angles. But then she remembered Rex's suffering eyes, remembered Philip's weeping in his living room, remembered Mary Johnson's hands shaking as she signed away her family's ranch. "You killed your wife," she said quietly. Clinton went very still. "What?" "Your business partner admitted it. She opposed your first land grab attempt, so you handled it. Made it look like an accident." For a long moment, Clinton said nothing. Then he laughed, a broken, bitter sound. "My wife, Julie. You want to know about Julie?" He leaned against the railing, staring out at nothing. "She didn't oppose my plans. She was part of them. We found the geological surveys together, planned the development together. She was smarter than me, more ruthless. The surveillance network was her idea." Tansie felt the ground shift under her feet. Then why? Because she wanted to go public, to bring in major corporations, to turn Gable's Pass into an industrial mining operation. I wanted to keep it local, controlled, sustainable. We argued about it for months, and then one night she was driving back from Missoula, and her car went off the road on a mountain curve. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Just gone. You didn't kill her, no. But everyone assumed I did, even her family, even though they never said it directly. And when Hargrove told you I had her killed, I let you believe it, because it made me sound more dangerous, more willing to do anything. Fear is a tool, Tansie. I've learned to use every tool available. Jesus, Clinton, what happened to you? Life happened. Disappointment. Watching everyone I cared about leave or give up or settle for less. You think I wanted to become this? I wanted... He stopped, took a breath. I wanted what we planned when we were 18. A life here, building something, mattering. But you left, and I learned that wanting things isn't enough. You have to take them. Tansie felt a wave of sadness for the boy Clinton had been, the dreams they'd shared. But the man in front of her had crossed too many lines, hurt too many people. Good intentions didn't excuse cruel methods. It's over, she said. The evidence is public. Federal agents are moving against you. Even if you run, they'll find you. I know. Clinton's voice was calm, almost peaceful. That's why I wanted to talk to you first, to explain, to make sure you understood that I wasn't a monster, just someone who cared too much about a place nobody else cared about anymore. The town meeting is tonight. Will you be there? Would it change anything if I wasn't? It would give the people you hurt a chance to confront you, a chance to take back their power. Clinton considered this, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll be there. I'll face them. It's the least I owe them, I suppose. He looked at her, and his expression held something like the boy she'd once loved. I did love you, you know. Even after you left. Even when I married Julie. Part of me was always waiting for you to come back. Funny how things turn out. Yeah, Tansie said. Funny. She left him standing on the tower, looking out at the town he'd tried to save and ended up destroying. The hike back to her truck felt longer than the hike up, weighted with revelations she hadn't expected. Clinton wasn't a simple villain. He was something more complicated, more tragic. A man whose love for his home had curdled into tyranny, whose ambition had destroyed the very thing he'd tried to protect. But complexity didn't excuse his actions. Tonight, he'd face the consequences. Tonight, Gable's pass would reclaim itself. Tansie drove back to town, her mind already moving to the next phase. The confrontation at the fire lookout had given her something unexpected. Not closure, but understanding. And understanding, she'd learned in combat zones and mountain solitude, was sometimes the heaviest burden of all. The town hall was built in 1892, a two-story brick building with high ceilings and tall windows that had witnessed generations of civic debates, celebrations, and confrontations. By 6 p.m, 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, people were already gathering outside. News vans from 3 different stations had set up in the parking lot. Reporters interviewed residents. Someone had brought a banner that read, "Truth for Gable's Pass." Tansie watched from across the street, sitting in her truck with Kaiser beside her. She'd changed into clean clothes. Nothing fancy, just jeans and a button-down shirt. But it felt strange after weeks in tactical gear and hiking clothes. She looked almost normal, almost like someone who belonged in this town. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from Kemp coordinating security, from Jolene confirming that all 14 residents were still committed to speaking, from Colonel Voss's team updating positions. Federal agents were stationed around town in unmarked vehicles, ready to move if Clinton tried to flee or if the situation turned violent. But Tansie hoped it wouldn't come to that. She hoped the town could have this moment, this confrontation, this reclamation of power, before federal authority took over. At 6:30, she saw Clinton arrive. He drove himself. No security detail. No entourage. He parked in his reserved spot near the front entrance and sat in his car for a long moment before getting out. Even from a distance, Tansie could see the weight on him, the exhaustion. He looked like a man who'd already lost and was just going through the motions of defeat. She met Kemp and Jolene at the back entrance of the town hall. Kemp was in full uniform, his service weapon visible on his hip. Jolene carried a laptop with all their evidence queued up and ready to present. "The projector is set up," Kemp said. "Sound system tested. We've got the first 3 rows reserved for our people, the residents who are speaking. Everyone else is general seating." "What's the mood inside?" Tansie asked. "Mixed. Some people are angry, supportive. Others are confused, think this is all a conspiracy theory. And some are still loyal to Clinton, believe he's being railroaded." Kemp's expression was grim. "This could go either way. Where's Clinton now?" "In his office, upstairs. He has the right to present first since he called the meeting. Then we'll request time for public comment." Jolene touched Tansie's arm. "Are you ready for this?" "I don't know, but we're here, so I guess it doesn't matter." They entered through the back door, climbing the stairs to the main meeting hall. The room was already 3/4 full, residents filling the wooden benches that served as seating. The air hummed with tension and anticipation. People whispered to each other, glanced at their phones, checked the doors. At the front of the room, a long table sat on a raised platform, the council's table, where Clinton and 4 town council members would sit. Behind it hung an American flag and the Montana state flag. A podium stood to one side, and next to it, the projector screen Kemp had mentioned. Tansie found a seat in the 4th row, between Jolene and Old Phillips. The 14 residents who would speak sat nearby, some looking determined, others terrified. Mary Johnson caught Tansie's eye and nodded, a warrior's acknowledgement between people about to enter battle. At exactly 8 o'clock, the 4 council members entered and took their seats. A moment later, Clinton walked in. The room fell silent. He looked at the crowd, his eyes passing over familiar faces, people he'd known for decades, people he'd helped, people he'd hurt. When his gaze found Tansie, he held it for a moment, and she saw something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Resignation, maybe, or relief. He sat at the center of the table and picked up a gavel, a ceremonial thing, barely used in informal Gable's Pass meetings. But tonight he used it, the crack of wood on wood echoing through the hall. "This meeting of the Gable's Pass Town Council is now in session," he said, his voice steady and formal. "Tonight we're here to discuss the Bitterroot Valley Development Initiative, a proposal that will—" "Point of order." Jolene stood up, her voice clear and strong. "Before you present, Mayor Deare, the citizens of Gable's Pass request time to present information relevant to this proposal." Clinton's jaw tightened. "Miss Hicks, the agenda has already been set. The agenda can be modified by majority council vote," Jolene said. "I'm requesting that vote now." One of the council members, a woman named Patricia Brennan, who'd been on the council for 20 years, spoke up. "I second the request for a vote." Clinton looked at his council, saw that he'd lost them. They'd all seen the website, heard the allegations. Whatever loyalty he'd commanded was gone. "Fine," he said. "All in favor of allowing public comment before my presentation?" 4 hands went up. Only Clinton abstained. "Motion carries," Patricia Brennan said. "The floor is yours, Jolene." Jolene walked to the podium, and Kemp moved to the laptop, ready to operate the projector. Tansie felt her heart hammering, but forced herself to breathe slowly, calmly. This was it. "Thank you," Jolene said. "I've lived in Gable's Pass my entire life. 62 years in this town, running the general store, serving this community. I never thought I'd stand here tonight accusing our mayor of crimes, but I can't stay silent anymore." She nodded to Kemp, and the first image appeared on the screen, the surveillance equipment from the mining office, clearly labeled and dated. A murmur ran through the crowd. "For the past 5 years," Jolene continued, "Mayor Deare has been operating an illegal surveillance network throughout Gable's Pass and the surrounding county. He's been spying on residents, gathering information, and using that information to pressure people into selling their property below market value." More images, the property maps, the acquisition timeline, the geological survey showing mineral deposits. With each slide, the murmuring grew louder. Some people looked shocked, others angry. A few called out questions, but Patricia Brennan gavelled for order. "Let her finish," Brennan said. Jolene spoke for 15 minutes, laying out the entire conspiracy. She kept her voice steady, her facts clear. When she finished, she looked directly at Clinton. "I ask you, Mayor Deare, do you deny these allegations?" Clinton sat motionless for a moment. Then he stood. "No," he said simply. "I don't deny them." The hall erupted. People shouted questions, accusations, demands. Patricia Brennan hammered the gavel repeatedly, calling for order. It took 5 minutes before the noise subsided enough for Clinton to continue. "But I want to explain," he said. "I want you to understand why I did what I did." "We don't need your explanations," someone shouted from the back. "Maybe not, but you're going to hear them anyway." Clinton's voice hardened. This town was dying, is dying. Every year, more businesses close, more young people leave, more houses sit empty. I found a way to save us, mineral deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars. enough to transform Gable's past, to give it a future. By destroying people? Phillips stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. I lost my store because of you. My family's legacy, 40 years of service to this community. Gone because you fabricated violations. Your store was failing anyway, Phillips. The building was outdated, the business model obsolete. I accelerated the inevitable. You had no right. Mary Johnson stood now, too. My family's ranch, 5 generations. You took it with lies and manipulation. Who gave you that power? I took that power because no one else would. Because this town needed someone willing to make hard decisions. You're a tyrant, Kemp said, standing in his uniform, his badge visible to everyone. You broke. Laws violated rights and traumatized people. And you did it for money. I did it for survival. Clinton's composure cracked. For this town's survival. Yes, some people suffered. Yes, I crossed lines. But at the end of it, Gable's past would have thrived instead of died. Can any of you honestly say you wouldn't make the same choice? The question hung in the air, and Tansie saw doubt on some faces. She stood up. I can, she said. The room turned to look at her. I can honestly say I wouldn't make that choice. Because tyranny doesn't save communities, Clinton. It destroys them. You didn't preserve Gable's past. You hollowed it out, turned it into a place ruled by fear instead of trust. Clinton looked at her, and for a moment, she saw the boy he'd been. You left, he said quietly. You left and I had to stay. You have no idea what it's like to watch everything you love slowly die. You're right, I left. I ran away from this town, from responsibility, from connection. I spent 15 years hiding in the mountains because I was too broken to face the world. But you know what I learned up there? That isolation doesn't save you. That running from pain just means you carry it with you. And that the only way to heal, yourself or a community, is together, in truth, not through control. She moved to the front of the room, standing between Clinton and the crowd. This town is hurting, has been hurting for years, but healing doesn't come from one man deciding what's best for everyone else. It comes from people choosing together, standing together, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. She turned to face the crowd. I'm not a hero. I'm not even really part of this community anymore. I gave up that right when I disappeared into the mountains. But I'm asking you now, all of you, to choose. Choose fear and let Clinton's methods stand, or choose courage and reclaim your town. The hall was silent. Then Phillips stood. I choose courage. Mary Johnson stood. I choose courage. One by one, the 14 residents stood. Then others, 30 people, 50, more. Until nearly the entire hall was on their feet, and the choice was clear. Clinton looked at them all, and something in him seemed to break. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice cracked. I'm so sorry. I thought I was saving you. But Tansie's right. I was destroying us, all of us. He set down the gavel and walked toward the door. Kemp moved to intercept him, but Tansie shook her head. Let him go with dignity. Federal agents were outside. He wouldn't get far, but Clinton didn't try to run. He stopped at the door and turned back. For what it's worth, I really did love this town. Then he was gone, and the hall erupted again, but this time with a different energy. Not anger, but release, like a wound finally opened to the air. The meeting dissolved into chaos after Clinton left. People crowded around the council table, demanding answers, asking questions, seeking reassurance. Patricia Brennan tried to maintain order, but the dam had broken. Years of suppressed fear and anger poured out in a flood of voices. Tansie slipped out the side door, following Clinton. She found him sitting on the steps of the town hall, his head in his hands. 2 federal agents in windbreakers stood nearby, waiting but not yet moving. They looked at Tansie questioningly, and she shook her head. Not yet. She sat down beside Clinton, leaving space between them, but close enough to talk quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Inside the hall, she could hear the muffled roar of dozens of conversations happening at once. "They're going to arrest me," Clinton said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Federal charges. RICO, probably. Maybe 20 years. Maybe. He laughed, a sound without humor. "You know what's funny? I actually believed I was doing the right thing. Not just telling myself that. Truly believed it. When did I become the villain in my own story?" Probably when you stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as obstacles. Clinton nodded slowly. The surveillance tech. It started small, just security cameras, nothing invasive. But then I realized how much information I could gather, how much leverage that gave me. And it became addictive, I guess. Knowing things, controlling outcomes, each step seemed justified in the moment. "That's how it always works," Tansie said. "Evil doesn't announce itself. It comes in small compromises, each one justified by the last." "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just someone who spent 15 years hiding from her own compromises. I know what it looks like when you can't face yourself in the mirror." Clinton turned to look at her, really look at her. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving when we were young? Every day. And never. It's complicated. If you'd stayed, do you think we could have—" "No," Tansie said gently. "We were kids with dreams that didn't fit together. I needed to leave. You needed to stay. And we were both too young to understand that love alone doesn't bridge those gaps." "I suppose not." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened to Rex? The dog?" "I don't know. Your security took him. Is he— Did you hurt him deliberately?" "God, no. The tech was supposed to be harmless, temporary, but the installations got infected, and I didn't know how to fix it without exposing the whole operation. So I just left him suffering. That's when I really knew I'd become someone I hated." One of the federal agents stepped forward. "Mr. Deare, it's time." Clinton nodded and stood up. Tansie stood too. For a moment they faced each other, and she saw the boy he'd been, ambitious, hopeful, full of plans. And then she saw the man he'd become, broken by his own choices, destroyed by the very ambition that had driven him. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything I did to this town, and for what I did to us all those years ago. I should have understood that you needed to go, should have supported that instead of resenting it." "I'm sorry too," Tansie said, "for disappearing, for not coming back when you needed someone, for letting you believe you were alone in trying to save this place." The agent put a hand on Clinton's shoulder, not roughly but firmly. "Sir." "One more thing," Clinton said to Tansie. "The mining office. There's a safe in the basement, behind the water heater. The combination is your birthday, the year we graduated, and my birthday. Inside is all the documentation, the real documentation, unedited. Everything I did, everyone I hurt. Make sure it gets to the right people." "I will." "And Tansie? Rex is at the veterinary clinic in Hamilton. I called them this morning, told them to do whatever it takes to help him. Send me the bill." He smiled faintly. "Though I suppose I won't be in a position to pay it." The agents led him to their car, rid him his rights, placed him in the back seat. Tansie watched the taillights disappear down Main Street, carrying away the boy she'd loved and the man he'd become. Behind her, the town hall door opened. Kemp and Jolene emerged, followed by residents still talking, still processing. When they saw Tansie standing alone on the steps, they came to her. "Is he gone?" Jolene asked. "Yes." "How do you feel?" Tansie considered the question. How did she feel? Sad, certainly. Relieved, exhausted. But also something else. Something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Connected. Part of something larger than herself. "I feel like it's over," she said. "And like it's just beginning." Kemp nodded toward the hall. "The council wants to talk to you. They're asking what happens next, how we start putting the town back together. I'm not the person to lead that. Maybe not. But you're the person who started it. Come on, Tansie. You can't just disappear back to the mountains now." Could she? A week ago, she would have said yes, without hesitation. But now, looking at these people, her people, whether she'd admitted it or not, she wasn't so sure. Tansie walked back into the town hall, and the conversation stopped. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward her, expectant, hopeful, waiting for her to say something profound or wise. She felt the weight of their attention and wanted to run. But she'd spent 15 years running. Maybe it was time to stand still. "I don't have answers," she said, and her voice carried in the sudden quiet. "I'm not a leader. I'm not even really part of this community. Not anymore. I gave that up when I walked away." "But you came back," Phillips said. "When it mattered, you came back." "I stumbled into this. I saw a suffering dog and couldn't look away." "That's what makes you the right person," Jolene said. "You didn't get involved for glory or power. You got involved because you saw something wrong and chose to act." Tansie looked around the room at faces she'd known, and faces that were new, at the architecture of the hall that had stood for over a century, at the flags that represented ideals of justice and community. What Clinton did, the surveillance, the manipulation, the corruption, that was evil. But he was right about one thing. This town is struggling, has been for years, and fixing it won't be simple. "What do you suggest?" Patricia Brennan asked from the council table. "I suggest you stop looking to one person for all the answers. That's how we got into this mess, by giving Clinton too much power, too much trust. Gable's past doesn't need another savior. It needs everyone to step up, to contribute, to take responsibility for their community." Mary Johnson stood. "But we need direction, organization. Someone has to coordinate. Then form committees, real ones with real power and real accountability. Don't just rubber stamp what one person decides. Debate, argue, make decisions together, even when it's messy." Tansie moved to the front of the room. "The mineral deposits Clinton talked about, they're real, worth a fortune. But that money belongs to all of you, not to outside corporations or corrupt officials. You could form a cooperative, manage the resources as a community, use the profits to rebuild honestly, sustainably." "How do we do that?" someone called out. "I don't know the details, but there are people who do. Lawyers who specialize in resource management, economic development specialists, community organizers. Reach out. Ask for help. Don't try to do it alone." "Will you help us?" Phillips asked. "At least at the start?" Tansie wanted to say no. Every instinct told her to retreat, to return to her cabin and her solitude. But she thought about Rex suffering in silence, about Phillips losing his store, about all the small cruelties that had accumulated, because people felt powerless to resist. "For a little while," she said finally. "I'll help you get organized, connect you with resources. But I'm not staying permanently. That's not who I am. Fair enough, Jolene said. We'll take what we can get. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. They formed committees for property recovery, economic development, legal action, and community healing. They voted to cooperate fully with federal investigators. They discussed how to handle businesses and properties that had been acquired under duress, whether to pursue civil suits, how to rebuild trust. Tansie mostly listened, occasionally offering perspective, but trying not to dominate. These were their decisions to make, their town to reclaim. She could facilitate, but she wouldn't control. At midnight, Patricia Brennan finally called an end to the meeting. We'll reconvene next week. Between now and then, committee chairs should meet with their groups, start making plans. And someone needs to contact the federal investigators, the state attorney general, and the media. We need to control our own narrative. People filed out slowly, some in groups still talking, others alone with their thoughts. Tansie found herself standing with Kemp and Jolene, the unlikely trio who'd started all this. You did good tonight, Kemp said. The town needed to hear what you said. I just told them what they already knew. Sometimes that's what people need, someone to say out loud what everyone's thinking. Jolene squeezed Tansie's hand. You'll really stay? Help us get started? For a few weeks, maybe a month. But then I need to go back to my cabin. I'm not built for this, for crowds and meetings and constant people. Nobody's asking you to change who you are, just asking you not to disappear completely. They walked out of the town hall together into the cold mountain night. Stars blazed overhead, brilliant and distant. The streets were quiet now, the news vans packed up and gone. Gable's Pass looked small and ordinary again, just a town in the mountains trying to survive. But something had shifted. Tansie could feel it, a lightness in the air, a sense that the town could breathe again. Fear had been replaced not with certainty, but with possibility. And possibility, she was learning, was more powerful than any one person's vision. Kaiser was waiting in her truck, patient as always. She scratched his ears and started the engine. But instead of driving to the trailhead, to the mountain path that led to her cabin, she drove to the motel. She'd stay another night, maybe another week, maybe longer. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, but something in her had changed too. The woman who'd found a suffering dog behind a dumpster wasn't the same woman who'd spent 15 years hiding from the world. Maybe she never would be again. 6 weeks later, Tansie stood on the porch of her cabin, watching the first serious snow of the season blanket the mountains in white. Kaiser and Rex lay side by side at her feet, the two German shepherds having bonded in the way that rescued souls often do. Rex had recovered from his surgery. The veterinary clinic in Hamilton had removed the surveillance devices and treated the infections. The scars would remain, but the pain was gone. She'd kept her promise to help Gable's Pass get organized, spending 3 weeks in town attending meetings, connecting people with resources, facilitating difficult conversations. The committees had formed and begun their work. Lawyers were pursuing the return of properties acquired under duress. Economic development specialists were helping the town explore options for the mineral deposits, leasing rights to ethical companies, forming a community trust, investing in sustainable development. Clinton was awaiting trial in federal custody. The charges were extensive: racketeering, conspiracy, illegal surveillance, fraud. His lawyer was negotiating a plea deal, but even with cooperation, he'd likely spend a decade in prison. Tansie had visited him once, in a federal facility in Great Falls. They'd talked for an hour, finding something like closure in their shared history. He'd asked her to forgive him, She'd said she'd try. The town was healing, slowly. Phillips had filed to reopen his hardware store, this time in a building the town would own cooperatively. Mary Johnson was fighting to get her ranch back, and public opinion strongly supported her. Jolene's general store had become an unofficial community center, a place where people gathered not just to shop, but to talk, to plan, to rebuild trust. And Deputy Kemp had been appointed interim sheriff after the former sheriff resigned under pressure. He was running unopposed in the special election, his courage in standing up to corruption having earned him respect and gratitude. Tansie had slipped away 2 weeks ago, hiking back to her cabin with Kaiser and Rex. The town had protested her leaving. They wanted her to stay, to serve on the council, to be part of the rebuilding. But she'd been clear from the start. She would help them begin, but she couldn't be what they needed long term. She was a catalyst, not a foundation. Still, she wasn't the same person who'd lived alone for 15 years. Something had changed in her during those weeks in town. The isolation that had once felt necessary now felt more like a choice than a prison. She still needed the mountains, still needed silence and space, but she also needed, occasionally, carefully, connection. She'd set up a satellite internet system that actually worked, had given Jolene and Kemp her email address, had promised to come to town once a month for community dinners that were becoming a tradition. Small steps toward balance, toward living in the world without being consumed by it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jolene. Town meeting next week. New development proposal. This one actually ethical. Would love your input if you're willing. Tansie smiled and texted back. I'll be there. She heard a vehicle approaching on the Forest Service road below, which was unusual. Few people knew the way to her cabin, and fewer still had reason to visit. She waited, hand near her rifle, old habits dying hard. A familiar truck came into view, Kemp's personal vehicle, not his patrol car. He parked and got out, holding a folder and looking slightly sheepish. I know you said not to bother you, he called up to the porch, but this couldn't wait. What is it? He climbed the steps and handed her the folder. Inside were legal documents, property deeds, transfer papers, official seals. The town council voted unanimously. They want to deed you 40 acres adjacent to your current land. Free and clear, no strings attached. It's their way of saying thank you. Tansie stared at the papers. I can't accept this. You can and you should. The land's not valuable for development. Too steep, too remote. But it extends your range, gives you more space, and it makes you officially part of Gable's Pass again, at least in the property records. I don't need payment for doing the right thing. It's not payment. It's recognition, acknowledgement, and maybe a hope that you'll stick around, stay connected, even from up here in your fortress of solitude. Tansie looked out at the mountains, at the endless wilderness she'd made her home. Then she looked at the papers, at the official recognition that she belonged somewhere, to something. For 15 years, she'd defined herself by what she'd left behind. Maybe it was time to define herself by what she'd found instead. Tell them thank you, she said quietly, and tell them I'll be at the community dinner next month. I might even bring a pie. Kemp grinned. You can bake? I can learn. After he left, Tansie sat on her porch with both dogs, watching the snow fall and thinking about journeys. The journey away from pain, the journey back toward connection, the journey of becoming someone you can live with. She'd thought the hard part was surviving war, but maybe the harder part was surviving peace, learning to live with yourself and others, finding balance between solitude and community. She thought about Clinton, about the boy he'd been, and the man he'd become, about how love for a place could turn to possession, and how possession could destroy the very thing you were trying to save. She hoped he'd find his own balance eventually, his own peace. But that was his journey to make. Hers led back to these mountains, to this cabin, to this life she'd built from isolation and hard work. But it also led, occasionally, carefully, back down to Gable's Pass, to community dinners and town meetings, and the messy, complicated work of being human among other humans. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is knowing when to walk away from people and when to walk back toward them. Tansie had finally learned the answer. You do both. You find your own space, your own peace, your own strength, and then, when you're ready, you share that strength with others, not by becoming their savior, but by standing beside them as they save themselves. The snow fell quietly, blanketing the world in white. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm, and for the first time in 15 years, Tansie Bellford felt like she'd found her way home, not to a place, but to herself.